Welcome to the Emerging Biotech Leader, where we help biotech leaders maximize the value of their therapeutics from clinical development to product launch. We're your hosts. I'm Kim Kushner.
And I'm Ramin Farhad. We are here to help you navigate the pitfalls of the biotech industry and illuminate the path forward.
Welcome to today's episode of the Emerging Biotech Leader. Today, we're very excited to welcome Dr. Azam. Oz is the CEO of Empyrean. He is a trained OBGYN. He left clinical practice in 1998 to join industry and has spent the last 24 years in what he is considered a biotech sandwich, which I'm very excited for us to talk about today, having really spent a lot of his career in big pharma with a lot of spattering of biotech experiences along the way that he's really learned a lot from that we'll have the opportunity to dig into today. We'll really hit three key themes. One, really kicking off, focusing on innovation in biotech and really what it means to lean into new innovation. We'll talk about agile organizational development and building different kinds of teams for different needs and different stages of your organization. And we'll also focus on the criticality of mentorship and growth and culture in organizations and what it really takes to lead into your network to get where you want to go in your career. So welcome to the show, Oz. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be with you both today.
So I do want to go to that brief anecdote that I just called out, your biotech sandwich, if you will. You spent a lot of time kind of coming in and out of biotech and learning a lot from big pharma that you've applied throughout your career. And I would love to start off today's show by just hearing a little bit about your experiences in biotech along the way and what you've learned that's really gotten to you to where you are now.
Yeah, so that filling story or the hamburger or whatever you want to call it, right? Depending on your preference. So yeah, it's a story of basically two halves. It initially started my career for the first decade, my professional life sciences career in big pharma, navigated companies like, Pfizer, J&J were my sort of main early years of the industry. Then I had a stint within a very innovative biotech called Aspriva that was very successful in its day. Then I started my own company right at the time when 2008, when the first credit crisis happened, which those who've been around long enough will recall. And then after that, I went back into big pharma. I spent 9 great years at Novartis, where I held various senior leadership roles, both in the US and globally and in Switzerland. And then I came back to really my desire, which was to be in very cutting edge, entrepreneurial, fast moving, fast paced biotechs. And most recently, I was at a great company called Tmunity, which I built from seed stage through to, its more formative years, 5 years there. And I'm really, really excited about now the introduction of Empyrean Neuroscience as a new company as well.
And throughout that story, and what I've found really fascinating is, before this show, we were talking, you gave us more detail about your background, was it seemed over the last, I'll make up timeframes, but 10, 15 years, you've really leaned into doing new things in the industry, whether you were in big pharma and you were carving out the CAR T business or what you were building at Tmunity, you were always trying to design and build something new and really change the nature of what a therapeutic could look like and change the practice of medicine. And that's really what you're doing at Empyrean. So can you talk to us a little bit about what it means to build something completely new where the healthcare institution in America is really not even prepared for what you're trying to introduce and what that means to design and build that? And then would love to translate that into what you're building now.
Yeah, so it's $1 billion question, right? Why do it? Who does it? I think you've got to be wired a certain way to want to do it. And it goes back to your individual level of benefit, risk, and comfort with innovation. And I think I've always been somebody who's curious by nature, very comfortable pushing the envelope scientifically, but ethically and appropriately. And so for me, I was very, very fortunate because, some things are you plan and some things you don't plan. So for example, if I give you an example, when I was at Novartis, I had, great leadership senior roles in regulatory affairs. I was the head of development for the US, was a chief medical officer for a while, US and in Switzerland. And then I had this amazing opportunity of building out the CAR T business from scratch as a sort of founding management team member. So that was something that, I was very fortunate because not all big pharmas allow you that opportunity. Novartis has that sort of DNA to it that they will take chances. I mean, they got into vaccines years ago when nobody wanted to do it. They got into stem cell therapies decades ago before somebody else did, anybody else did. And so I think I was lucky as well. It's not just about what you make, but the luck that you have and the organizations you pick. And one of the reasons I went to Novartis was that I saw them not just as a giant big pharma, but I did see that sort of desire to push the envelope and look at new therapeutic strategic areas. So some of it's planned, some of it's unplanned. So hopefully that can be a flavor of how those events have occurred.
Absolutely. And how is that all translated to what you're building now? So Empyrean is truly building a new class of medicine.
Yes, so from a platform and company perspective, Empyrean is a genetic engineering company in neuroscience. And what we're specifically trying to do is to genetically engineer small molecules from different species of fungi and plants with a view to creating human therapeutics. And nobody's ever done that before. But when I looked at this opportunity, after having spent a decade in cellular therapies and gene therapies and sort of the learnings of developing CAR Ts, this really caught my imagination that, what is possible if you bring together sort of the same sophistication and rigor of T cell genetic engineering to a kingdom and species that have been undervalued and underappreciated. And can you get that neuroscience revolution and say the genetic engineering CRISPR evolution to meet with a view to actually, thinking the unthinkable. Nobody's ever done this before. And the more I looked at it, the more I saw huge potential for patients in areas like neuropsychiatry and neurology, but potentially in other therapeutic disease areas in the future as well, to be determined, depending on how the platform develops and evolves. So I'm really, really excited about what we're going to be doing in Empyrean over the next, year or two. We're a preclinical company with ambitions to be in the clinic in a year from now. We're looking at introducing the world's first botanical that is a genetically engineered mushroom whole product that contains psilocybin for treatment for patients suffering with disorders such as major depressive disorders. And so, a huge unmet need area, but a very novel way to attack the problem, the unmet need. And so, I'm applying a lot of the principles of genetic cellular engineering I've learned. And I was really fortunate to be taught by great people like, Carl June, Bruce Levine, like, people who are real players in the field and teams of people who really, really taught me so much. Your own employees at companies who are real subject matter experts. Because as a leader, you're only the voice piece for the people that you represent at the end of the day. And so now we're charting unknown territory, and we're doing it at a time which is frankly an incredibly difficult market. We're dealing with significant headwinds. You've seen the macroeconomic environment, so it's not the easiest time to be an innovator. So the innovator's dilemma is always there in front of you. How do you fund and capitalize companies like this? How do you convince people of the value? How do you incubate companies for the foreseeable future when access to capital is going to be limited? So these are very interesting times to be an innovator, but innovation doesn't stop. And I'm always a believer that it's when you go through some of these more darker market moments that great things emerge. So I'm really excited and jazzed about what we're going to be doing at Empyrean. As I say, we're a small company, 9 people, very lean, efficient, and we get stuff done very quickly, which is kind of the nice thing about small organizations, the agility, the nimbleness of a company at this stage. And all companies evolve and grow, and it will not stay like this forever. But it sure is a lot of fun when you're in the stages, when you can wear different hats, when you can get different things done and really sort of have a canvas in which to draw your story. That's the exciting thing about biotech. So you've got to have that kind of appetite to do that. Some colleagues are not wired like that. They prefer more structure and form, right? So biotech, early stage biotech may not be the thing for them. They may gravitate more to more mature opportunities where there's a biotech that has established as a platform is maybe in the clinic. So it really depends on you reflecting on yourself, on what you're good at, what you're enjoying, and what your level of risk taking is really at the end of the day.
I'm going to follow up with a question with regards to neuroscience, and then I would like to transition to the resources that you just brought up and how do you get things done with the limited resources. How did you specifically come up with a neuroscience focus? I know that's where you started your career a decade ago or so in neuroscience. Was there a specific reason or data set that kind of made you make that decision to focus on neuroscience, or was there another reason?
Part of it, Ramin, was the fact that, it was already in play for Empyrean as a company. Part of it was my curiosity and focus as well. So why neuroscience? I mean, neuroscience still remains an area of huge unmet need and huge market opportunity. Aging populations, the need for treatments in Alzheimer's, other areas. We're seeing, all the challenges that are in the field. We see excitement and then, not failure, but as much as, roadblocks for drugs in that area. And I think going back to my own personal journey in neurosciences, my first sort of foray really into neurosciences in a major way was when I first started my career in neuropathic pain. So an area that is still poorly understood, but mechanistically now more understanding, treatments emerging. But really the paradigm hasn't changed for pain much in the past 2-3 decades. And then I was really fortunate at Novartis because I had the opportunity to look at everything in neurosciences. But my main focus in neuroscience at Novartis was working in MS, a neuroinflammatory T-cell based etiological disorder, which has immunology, has neurology, has everything that, and it's probably my first foray into T cells, really, when I think about it, because T cells are implicated in MS. So, I think there was a bias in my mind because I'd worked in the space for sure, and I enjoy it scientifically. I'm a pluripotent guy when it comes to science. As long as the science is interesting, I don't care. I love science, right? No matter what the disease area is. I've never viewed myself as a subject matter expert, although maybe the past 10 years, because of my CAR T and T cell background, people see me as an expert in that area, but I don't view myself that way. I view myself as a broad-based drug development kind of guy. And then part of the story was the fact that the company had already made inroads at a seed stage to focus on neuroscience, but it remains a highly attractive and underserved area, particularly if you look at fields like neuropsychiatry, you look at schizophrenia, look at the areas of depression. Take depression as an example, which is going to be a key area for us. I mean, there hasn't been a revolution in psychiatry for over 30 years. I mean, the last revolution was the introduction of SSRIs. And SSRIs, when you look at data objectively, at best, you're getting 30 to 40% responses, maybe 50 for a short period of time. But chronic treatments that, don't always pan out. You get treatment-resistant depression, and then look at the recent pandemic and how that's highlighted the huge, even further unmet need when it comes to mental health and neuropsychiatric conditions. So hopefully I gave you a sense, Ramin. Partly it was my desire and focus, but partly also was the circumstances where the company was already looking at this from a sort of initial concept perspective. And to me, it made sense. It's an underserved area, huge potential opportunity, and it's exciting.
That's amazing. It seems like everything is coming together very nicely.
Let's hope so. Science has a way of surprising you, right? Good and bad.
Good and bad, of course.
They always do. And I guess my last question with regard to, the new therapeutic class that you're building at Empyrean, you've spoken about the platform and what the potential is, and especially in the neuroscience space, there's such a huge unmet need. How are you thinking about prioritizing your portfolio, the targets that you're going after, and what you're going to bring to market? And in prior conversations on this show, we've talked a little bit about the balance of really leaning into a platform approach versus being really specific on a real clear therapeutic target and what you're building in that space. So how are you balancing those two pieces? And can you talk to us about your near-term portfolio prioritization and where you're focusing?
Yeah, so, I've grown up listening to two sets of advice over the years, right? So some people say you're either a platform company and that's your focus, or you're a product therapeutic company. And I think the inconvenient reality is you're somewhere in the land of both usually. Unless you're very, very early upstream with a platform that needs validation, where clearly you are a discovery research stage company versus a periclinical, emerging clinical company. So I think it's always the yin and yang, right? It's always a push and pull of, do you focus on the platform and do you focus on the lead asset and programs, and how do you prioritize? And that is always the number one challenge. And what I've learned is that, whatever your strategic plan is year one, it's never going to be a strategic plan in 5 years from now. So you have to deal objectively and you have to be able to pivot. That's the hallmark of being a biotech CEO. All best laid plans of mice and men, as they say. And so for a company like Empyrean, we have an incredible platform that has huge potential, but we have to be incredibly smart where we focus our resources and effort. So our number one priority is that we have developed a lead candidate that is now undergoing IND enablement studies with a view to getting into the clinic. So this is the world's first genetically engineered whole mushroom product where we have successfully engineered a mushroom species to overproduce psilocybin as one of the active alkaloids in the product, but also increasing other rarer alkaloids, because we believe that there is the benefit potential of the synergistic effects of different components working together produce a better result in a human setting versus than just a single synthetic product working on one receptor. And that is a laser-like focus for us as a company, because that's going to create the greatest value as we develop that and get that into patients. However, we also have that platform that's delivered that ready now and being actively explored for the next generation of assets to be emerging. But there is always that push and pull of how much resource. We're a 9-person company, right? Which is where I think we'll talk about companies at different stages and how you evolve them, why we built a specific model at this time in our lives, which is partnering with groups like SSI, because it's the right model for this, right? Just like leaders are for seasons, there are models for seasons, right? To get you where you need to. So this push and pull is always going to be there, and you have to constantly evolve it. And you also have the courage. You also have to have the courage, scientifically and business-wise, to say no and put things on the shelf, which is always painful to do. And we've even had those dialogues at an early stage where, clearly you think about the kingdom of fungi and plants. That's an extraordinary, huge opportunity, right? So we can go in many different directions scientifically, especially when you have very creative entrepreneurial scientists as well. But you're going to have control and focus, and that's the job of the leader, right? To paint the canvas and show, this is what makes sense for the company at this time. Doesn't mean to say you ignore other things, but you're going to have to incubate those in a much more judicious manner. Then as funds arise, as financings happen, as you achieve success, but success becomes success, right? So you've got to have success and milestones and show deliverables, and then good things will happen. You don't show those milestones happening, then nothing happens, right? And so that's always the yin and yang of biotech, of how do you focus and pick that one thread that you can really march forward, where a lot of investors and folks are going to focus on, but at the same time you can showcase and say, and if we get this right, look at the amazing potential that we have here. I mean, that's how we do things at Empyrean.
And Oz, I mean, it's your background so fascinating. You've been with companies 100,000 people plus, right? I think Novartis is close to 130 or 140,000. You've been with companies much less than that, and you have also started your own company with 9 people, right? So you've seen what works, what doesn't work. You've seen the best, you've seen the worst, and the resource and being resourceful is always a challenge, right? Especially with the smaller biotech companies. But although even with big companies, resources is still limited. It's never unlimited. And the mindset of fixed resource allocation or linear algorithm that you've talked before about doesn't necessarily apply. How did you pivot from having all the resources, for example, in the CAR T side and at Novartis, to going back to a really smaller startup, nine people company? How do you pick where do you start from, and how do you outsource? How do you decide about sequencing your resource needs and outsourcing some of those needs?
So it's a $1 billion question, right? So you talked about, I think the other day we talked about this linear algorithmic fixed model, right? That what I meant was that in larger organizations, there are usually pre-baked algorithms for programmatic resource allocation, right? So you see within the world of a program that is phase 1 moving into proof of principle setting phase 2, that you need X people in regulatory, X people in program management, X people in data management, biostatistics, etc., clinical development, and that is done because the company needs command and control of a huge ship. It's a aircraft carrier that isn't easy to move, right? And within that, you kind of have to play that game. And so you build your budgets and plan according to, well, okay, I'm going to need X number of people because that's how it's done in another program. So I very much grew up in that environment. But even then, a company like Novartis was very good at challenging. And I think the beauty was I was very fortunate that I got to build this business scientific R&D unit within a big behemoth, but was kind of firewalled a bit. So I had a degree of freedom where I could build and try different models. And at some point, the scale of the model is to a point where you just grow big, right? Because of the necessity of the business, and that happened in Novartis, right? So when I moved to Biotech, it is really hard. It's a very different mindset. So when I was building out Tmunity, it was myself and another guy for a year, Michael Cristiano, who was my chief business officer. He and I started the company. But we had a very interesting model there because we were doing all of our research through University of Pennsylvania with Carl June and the June labs. So it was a very symbiotic model where we were front-facing in terms of fundraising, strategic thinking, etc., but the backroom operations were all in an academic unit. And then slowly, as we raised finances, secured our Series A, then we started our build. And I think the build was fast, right? That those first 10, 15, 20 employees that you hire, that's the heart of the company, right? So that happened relatively fast because we had the capital to do it, right? And then you stage your build according to what you want to do and, frankly, what your investors advise and your boards advise, right? And so that was a very different model. And I had huge success in the model. I made some mistakes and blunders like all CEOs do. Some things, for example, I made assumptions around, hey, such and such a person was great working with me in Novartis. They would be a great fit here. And it was interesting in the early days when I contacted people who I thought would be perfect for the fit. When we assessed them in that environment, they weren't the right fit. And, the default was I'll go to that person because if they did that role there, they clearly can do the role here. But even in that first 6 months of where we didn't do any hiring, first year we didn't do any hiring, it was me and Michael. We saw, right, that, everybody doesn't fit in their function in a different environment. That was the first lesson I had. And so, you learn quickly, right, that you throw those assumptions out the window and you better quickly. And I've always been a big believer in diversity. I don't mean the typical diversity and inclusion metrics that people talk about in corporate dashboards. I frankly think that most of that is a facade. But what I really care about is diversity in teams, right? True diversity, right? Because if you hire a diverse team, it's not just your phenotype as a human being, that what you bring to the party and the table. And I think that was the penny really dropped for me in the second year, which was, no, it's not about creating clones of what I knew in my business unit in Novartis. It's about creating a very different ecosystem. And then you start to think differently, right? So these were the challenges I faced building out a startup and a buy. And I think every company builder goes through these anxieties and pains, and some people work out, some don't. But I think the first thing is, if it's not working out, do the person a favor, your employee a favor, and yourself, and cut the cord quickly and do the right thing. Because letting them stay in an environment where they're not going to be successful and you're not successful, people getting happy, that's one thing about biotech, which is people say there's so much turnover in biotech. And it isn't really, but it perceives like that. But companies that are turning people over, and not necessarily because they've hit a wall, like Tmunity, for example, my company, we had a very legitimate clinical setback and we restructured the company. That happens to companies all the time. But it's not unusual to see changes in the C-suite or changes in level of management. And it's just the way it is, that because you're small and nimble, you get exposure much earlier. There aren't layers to hide. Big pharma, you can hide out.
Right. A smaller biotech, you have to have a very agile organization. Otherwise, you won't survive. Do you find it more challenging to attract the right talent, experience, expertise when you're a company of 10, 20, 30 people versus when you are?
I think the challenge is that it's not difficult to get active interest. I've never had that an issue in biotech. What is difficult is landing the right talent that you want, right? The field of genetic engineering, cell therapies is ferociously competitive, right? Because, it's a field that's exploded very quickly, and not many people knew about the field or had practical experiences, but now it's very different from 10 years ago. When I first got in cell therapies, there wasn't that much talent. It was talent that had to be developed. Now that talent's being developed. So different season that we're in now. I think it's hard landing who you think is the right player for the team. I don't think biotechs have shortage of people. And now with restructures going on in big pharma and things like that, I don't think there's a shortage of talent. I think there's still a war for talent for landing the right phenotype and chemistry and fit for your company.
And Oz, what is that right phenotype? That I'm sure Kim, I see it knocking her head, asking the same question, because I'm sure a lot of our listeners want to know what does it take? What are those 3 to 5 things that is the phenotype or a profile?
And so look, I'm speaking for myself and my company and my desires, right? So I wouldn't want listeners to think this is the formula or template for every biotech, right, or every small hungry organization. But look, what springs to mind, right? So you have to have a passion to really enjoy science, right, and love it, and be a nerd, right, and dig in, but you've got to know when to stop, right? So that curiosity is really, really important. I look for that, right? If I'm looking for a subject matter expert in an area, how deep are they going to go, and can they go even further, right? So that's a trait that I look for. I'd also want to see resilience and tenacity, right? Track record of people who've, wherever they've been, big or small pharma, really showcasing the challenges that they face, and authentically, right? What was your role in that? What did you do? Success or failure doesn't matter, right? Because successes build you, failures build you, right? So really showcasing, what was tenacious and resilience about what you did, because what we do is very high risk. Let's not beat around the bush. Most companies in biotech don't come through. Every day, if you see a company launching, you see 2 other companies right now folding. That's the nature of biotech, right? So it requires tenacity, resilience. So I look for that. I think you also look for, trust. Is this somebody that I can trust and they can trust me in return, and they're going to stick, right? Because there's nothing worse in the biotech world than incubating, growing a talent, because they bring something to the table, but you're passing your knowledge to them, to have them walk out the door because they're a company hopper or whatever. Nobody wants that, right? So I try and look for those traits of look, and there are legitimate reasons why some people move every 2 years, right? An M&A happened or something else happened. Other cases, you might see patterns of people jumping around. So I always advise people, right? Show that you've had some stickiness at a role within a company. I was really fortunate coming out of Novartis. I was there 9 years. In 9 years, I had 4 different roles. So on paper, I was like every 2 years, I got pushed into a new role, but I was there. So, but I could demonstrate a linkage, right? Of, yeah, I did this, but then I got moved to this, etc. And so being with an organization for 10, 20 years is not a bad thing if you can show you've demonstrated movement and growth and development professionally. And in smaller companies, it's different because smaller companies by nature may not survive more than 3 years, 4 years, right? So legitimate changes happen, right? So you look for patterns and you look for people being comfortable telling their story, right? And the last thing I look for is fun, guys. I don't want to work with people that I don't want to have fun with. Life's too short, life's too boring. You want to be in a culture which is dynamic, where you work hard, you play hard. And, the world has changed a lot with the pandemic, right? And so we're doing much more of this than being together, right? And I think, frankly, that CEOs that visualize that people are going to walk into buildings again and everyone be together and have kumbaya, they're deluded. The world has moved in a way that will never change. So you have to have different skills as a team leader, builder, of how do you get cohesion in a culture built in a semi-virtual environment. So I didn't grow up with that. None of us grew up with that. But I tell you, in the past 3 years or so, we've all had to abide by that. And now you're seeing, right, it's the norm. Big pharma, small pharma, you've got 2 groups of CEOs that say, I will demand that all my employees come in. Good luck to he or she. And you've got those that are saying, well, I've got to mold my thinking and my world to adapt to what is the reality of the world we're living in, in this globalized, fast moving, Zoom centric world that we live in. So hopefully I gave you some themes there on how I think about the traits I look for.
I love that you called out that fun is an attribute that you're looking for. A little insight into the consulting sector. We call that the airport test. Do you want to be at the airport with somebody if you're stuck and your plane's delayed? If you like them enough to be stuck there and have a drink, you probably want to work with them. So definitely appreciate that. How are you thinking about those are such important attributes in bringing people onto your team, but we also know that, and you mentioned this a little earlier on in the conversation, you're building a really agile team. It's not just your 9 FTEs, it's other partners and a multitude of partners that you're really surrounding the organization with. How are you building a culture around this extended team that ultimately is propping up and engaging the organization to meet your milestones?
So, I mean, there's some basics, right? Just good human nature, right? How you communicate, how you be transparent. So, look, if somebody is on the team, they're from the SSI group or any other group, right? I mean, they're your team, right? So make them feel like they're your team, right? Which means you make time. If you need to have a one-on-one, you have a one-on-one. You need to be deliberate in your communications. Yeah, you have to trust them, right? And that's just the hallmarks of any team. So I think the first thing is when you do a hybrid model, and I'm a huge fan of a hybrid model for companies at our stage, especially companies that are research translational looking to move to the clinic. One of the risks that I've seen, and I've been victim of it before myself, right, is that you overbuild. And you overbuild, and if something goes wrong, you miss a milestone, then you're in a position where it's what do I do now? I don't want to do a restructure, but how do I manage costs? How do I do this? So, one of the schools of hard knocks and lessons I've learned is be smart about the timing of hiring. Doesn't mean to say you're not going to grow the company and hire, but look for, I call them augmented models, right? So we have an augmented model now with a number of players, right? I mean, we really have a clinical development, translational operations that's working through partners like SSI. And then we have benchtop wet lab research, genetic engineering that we own. And it's a beautiful combination, right? Where we can stage in at this time of the company's history, where we want to remain agile, we want to remain fast, we don't want too much bureaucracy, but we want to have the right discipline of functions getting involved. We've decided to build this model, and it applies for G&A and legal as well, right? For finance and legal, where it's virtual, it's augmented, and it works incredibly well. But it requires the CEO and the C-suite to be very disciplined, right? I do a lot of different hats. Like I'm the guy who does IT. I do, a lot of the finance stuff with my controller, and that's okay. But you've got to want to do that. So it's not everybody's, as they say, cup of tea. It depends on you as an individual and what you sign up for. And certain groups just don't subscribe to that, right? It works for us. But I think it's a phenomenal model because it allows me degrees of freedom to flex up and flex down. And look, and if it doesn't work with an individual, you can say a request, could we have somebody else that is a better fit for the company for these reasons? And it's just, and you can do it, right? So, I mean, that's the advantages I see of an augmented model for a company at this stage. Now, then there comes a point where it doesn't make sense. You need a resource internally as an FTE to lead a certain part of the organization, right? So then you start to scale and bring down your augmentation model, and you switch more to an FTE model. That's okay too, right? It will come with time. But we are as a company right now, this sort of peri-clinical, about to be in the clinic in a year to 18 months, a lot of moving pieces, a lot of headwinds, a lot of things happening in the external environment, new innovation. This model makes perfect sense to us.
I mean, that's a great advice, especially focusing on that whole sequencing resource needs, and be very strategic and selective of when, right, do you need exactly what and what type of a profile and attributes. And I think another phenotype that perhaps to the solution providers or the outsourcing model provides is the attribute of the people as well. That most of the time, I think you will see that the folks that are in a consulting role or they are in a partnership role with the company have the phenotype being more agile, more kind of thinking on their feet, being able to deal with uncertainty and ambiguity better, because that's kind of what required from that job as well.
Yeah, and I agree with you there because there's a what's the word I'm looking for? There's a restlessness there. You can spot it in people, right, where they want to keep moving, and so you look for that, right, and you want that in your teams anyway, right? And I think, like I say, it's leaders for seasons and teams for seasons, right? And it's just getting that balance right. And it's an art, it's not a science.
It definitely is. Oz, let's talk about. I think the other day you mentioned that the CEOs are one of the loneliest people on the planet.
It's the loneliest job in the world.
It's the loneliest job in the world. And you talked about it's critical to build an executive leadership network, right? And you really don't, honestly, don't have to be a CEO to build that. We all need that in our career, throughout our career, to build that network. And you were very adamant about it, and it seemed like you have a way of going about it that has been very effective for you. Can you talk about that and give us some advice? How did you do it, and how does one that not necessarily is a CEO should go about building that executive leadership networking?
So it's a great question. So, I mean, it's evolved. My model evolved over time, right? And I'm sure this has evolved for other leaders and, people in our industry. I mean, in the early days, it's about which team you get on, right? Which program, which asset you get on, right? When you're in big pharma, oh, do I want to work on that program? I heard that team's really good, and that program may launch, so I want to get onto that program. So in the earlier years of my career, I was very focused on that, and then I realized that actually that's bullshit. What you want to look at is who the leader is for that program or team, and how are they navigating it? Because sometimes the asset is what the asset is. It can be an average asset, but if you got a great team and a great leader, they can do wonders, right? You can have good assets and a terrible leader, and the waste of space and time, right, and money. So I mean, I evolved my thinking when I observed carefully and learned that actually getting hooked to good leaders is the trick, as opposed to the program, right? And I'm talking in a specific reference of big pharma at that time point. So obviously when you're in big pharma, your world is big pharma because that's all you really know. And you're surrounded by thousands of people, colleagues with seniority to you, people who've really done it time and time again, and you learn like a sponge. And through that, you realize who the people are that you want to go and network, right? And big pharma's great. I mean, J&J is a great example, former buddy systems, mentorship. It was great. Same with Novartis, right? So you have those pre-baked lines where you may be in a formal mentoring program, right? Or you're a rising leader where they want to plug you in and expose you to different styles of leadership, right? So I mean that was very prescriptive and thought through, and that was great because it works, right? In the earlier years of your career as a younger leader, moving up the ranks or learning how to navigate a business, and then as you go from having a lot of hair to no hair, you suddenly realize, right? There's a big yeah, and you have a whole world out there, and then as you become more comfortable in your therapeutic areas where you're working, you network more. You attend more networking events, right? You go to conferences, and part of the reason of going to conferences is not just the science, but who am I going to meet in the bar, and who can I network with, right? And you get to know people from other companies, and then it's amazing who you come across, right, in those settings, and you realize, hey, there's a whole world out there. And then, for example, when I was like in the last decade of my career, I got heavily involved in the Alliance of Regenerative Medicine, an amazing advocacy, patient-centric, industry-sponsored organization that looks at every facet of cell and gene therapies. I met everybody who's who from both the CDMO side, the contracting side, the vendor side, and the company side, right? And that was amazing, right? Because you just get, to know everybody, and hey, I need help in vector methodology or something, and you know exactly which person to go to, right? Or I'm having problems with this reagent. Hey, such and such I met deals with this. Maybe they can help out. So, I mean, there's that immediate sort of sponsorship, but then you start to see CEOs in that setting more. So you develop CEO buddies. And there's 3 or 4 people that I trust that I'm going to call. One of them used to work for me, is a better, more successful CEO than me. So I call him a lot. There are other individuals that I've worked, with who are great CEOs that, were senior to me, maybe have now transitioned more into a different phase of their life. They're doing more boards, not operational work. So, you build that buddy system of peer CEOs, right? And then, what? Ultimately, you always rely on people who are your best bosses, right? No matter where they are in the world, right? To lean on them. And that's kind of your sort of more father figure that you would go to, right, for sage advice around, personal issues or professional issues, right? And then I think the what I've learned sort of most recent in my life in the past couple of years is mentorships comes from all guises and shapes, nothing to do with your own industry and sector. So, recently I met somebody who's a poet, and somebody who is an accomplished writer. I'm learning so much from them in a very different relationship. He wouldn't view me as a mentor-mentee, but I view a certain mentor-menteeship kind of relationship because he gets me to think in ways I would never have thought. Why would I cross paths with somebody in the world of arts, being a life sciences guy? But it's amazing if you drop your blinkers and you start to think, that there's a lot more to the world than meets the eye. It's amazing what you can learn from each other, right? And it's just a case of perspective and blinders. So, I may be quirky about this. That's my perspective around mentoring. And, again, stages of life, stages of professionalism require you to apply different approaches. But I will agree with you. It is the most loneliest job to be the CEO of a company, especially a company itself, because you can't talk to anybody, right?
The point you're making about seeking mentorship also outside of your network, right, it makes a lot of sense because it does give you a different perspective, and I think it feeds into your creativity and being innovative, and things see completely different. That
orthogonal thinking, right?
Right.
It's orthogonal thinking, right? We need more of that, because that's how. And we're all victims to. We're a highly, highly regulated industry, guys, right? So we do things by the book, right? But there's a risk of that is that you become a cog in a wheel, right? Of mechanically deliver something to an FDA standard, regulatory standard, etc. So there's going to be an infusion of creativity somewhere along the way, right? To keep this machine innovative and moving in a very different way.
It's also interesting. I recently met someone at a conference that came from another highly regulated industry. I think they came from the aerospace industry, and they'd recently moved over to life sciences. And in their mind, it was such an easy parallel because they understood how to translate regulation into what it meant from a day-to-day basis and building products and medical devices.
That's a great example. So, if you look at the airline industry, which funny enough, I had to look at very heavily, believe it or not, when I built the CAR-T business.
Interesting.
Because of, you think about security, risk management, assessment, how the aeronautical industry has to think about safety around planes. We were looking at safety in the early days, right? Chain of identity, how you move a product, like, human living cells that have been genetically engineered, how you move this through. So I actually spoke to people in the aeronautical industry, and I actually spoke to people in Dubai who ran the logistics of Dubai Airport. It's amazing what you pick up when you think and talk to people in allied sectors, right? And I've had the pleasure of talking to people in the oil industry. You wouldn't think there was much in common with the oil industry and the gas and oil industry with that. There's a lot. There's a lot when you start to talk to people and say, oh, wow, we have that. It might not be the same, called the same thing, but there's a lot of analogies. The way, for example, that deals happen in the oil industry and mergers and acquisitions, there's a lot of similarities that apply to pharma as well. And so, that vehicle of other industries as you mature and get old in your career, I think is a really important thing.
Thank you. I know, Oz, we've come to the end of our program, and this has been just a fascinating show. And I want to thank you for sharing your knowledge, expertise, all of your learnings in such a candid and kind of easy way, that pragmatic way that we can actually take some of these back and kind of apply it to our day-to-day work. Really appreciate the time.
Thank you for your kind words. It's great hanging out with you today. Thanks, Kim.
And congratulations. We're excited for Empyrean, seeing all that you're going to be building.
Take care.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks for tuning in to the Emerging Biotech Leader, an SSI strategy podcast. Join us each month for more conversations with biotech leaders. If you'd like to help navigating the complexities of biotech, reach out to our team at ssistrategy.com. Don't forget to hit subscribe and leave a review.